It is 8:30. We have a council member who's still on her way, but she'll be here in a moment. So I think we'll start. I'm going to open the Boise City Council Budget Workshop of June 28th. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Agent.
Here.
Clegg.
Here.
Halliburton.
Here.
Sanchez. Willits. Here. Woodings. Here. 5 present, 1 absent.
Thank you. And we have the mayor online with us. Welcome, Mayor.
Thank you. Thanks, Presiding Council President.
All right. Well, the second order of business is to get right into the workshop. We have theme, strategies, and approach with Eric Bilmoria to set the stage for us for the next 30 minutes. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Madam Mayor, Council President, Council Pro Tem, Council members, and members of the public. It's my pleasure this morning to present the proposed fiscal year 23 proposed budget for the city of Boise. The development of the budget is a months-long exercise that involves many people from throughout the organization, from the mayor's office to our executive management team, budget office and finance managers to operational experts across the organization. The budget attempts to allocate resources in the most efficient manner possible for the purpose of delivering efficient and optimal services to the community. This morning we'll aim to achieve several objectives, including the following. We will provide an overview of the themes, strategies, and approaches that were employed in developing this budget. We'll provide a comprehensive overview of the city's revenues and expenditures with a heightened emphasis on the general fund. We'll provide details on property taxes and the relief measures included in this budget, as well as discussing burden shift with some new examples. We'll do an overview of the capital program and our proposed fee changes. And finally, we'll be seeking direction from the City Council that will enable the budget to move along into the next step in the review and approval process, which is the public hearing scheduled for July 19th. I'll start off with just an overview of the process, including elements that we've already worked through. From a city council perspective, we had a budget overview to really kickstart the process on March 29th. That same day, we had a budget interactive where members of the community came in and provided feedback and input on the proposed budget process. That interactive took place at Hillcrest Library. Last month, we had the budget workshop, the first budget workshop, where all of the departments came and presented on various department initiatives in progress. We released our budget book on June 17th, which leads us to today. Subsequent to this, we will have the public hearing on July 19th, leading up to the ultimate adoption of the budget on August 30th. From a public engagement perspective, I mentioned that budget interactive on March 29th. On March 31st, the budget website was made available for a period of public comment. Those comments were forwarded along to the City Council after approximately 2-week period of being open. The budget website was again updated about 10 days ago. When the budget document was released, there was another opportunity for online public feedback. That opportunity will be open until July 18th, and any feedback that is submitted will be passed along to the City Council in advance of the July 19th public hearing. So again, reiterating, our budget document was released on June 17th. It's available on our website. Additionally, there's an opportunity for any members of the public who might be watching today to interact with the current year budget and prior year budgets through the city's budget transparency tool, which was launched last calendar year. Just reiterating our agenda for today, we'll go through the themes, strategies, and approach in our budget build. I'll do an overview of the fiscal year 23 budget in the general fund, going through revenues and expenditures. We'll look at our capital fund, fees, and then move on to motions and next steps. So I'll start with some themes, strategy, and approach. The first thing is, kind of maybe setting the stage, looking at our current economic climate. And this budget really attempts to strike a balance between the positive elements that are present within our economy, low unemployment, rising wages, and growth, with some of the challenges and risks that are emerging. Some of those challenges and risks include high inflation, housing shortage, and the continued property tax burden shift. So in evaluating this balance, the budget aims to make some targeted investments in community services and support functions, provide relief where possible, as well as provide tools to respond to potential economic challenges or changes.
Eric, just a real quick question here. And before I ask that question, I did not welcome everyone online who may be watching. This is our yearly budget hearing or budget workshop. We have a budget hearing next month where we'll take comments from the public. But at this workshop, we work with staff and go through budget that has been proposed so that we can send it out so that the public can comment on it. And that's what we're about today. My question, Eric, is whether or not I only saw one place in the budget book, and I know it's been shifting recently where we talked about a potential recession. And as you go through today, I'd just be interested in understanding the places where that might cause some problems with what we're proposing and what the remedies would be. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And we have references to that throughout the presentation, and we can speak to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Looking at some high-level themes, the first one I'll touch on, which is first and foremost each year when we develop our budget, is fiscal responsibility. We always seek to ensure that we have not only a balanced budget on a one-year term, but also a balanced forecast. We do a 10-year forecast to ensure that any short or near-term decisions we make are sustainable over the long term. We have included in this budget, we have a proactive use of one-time funding, and we do seek to align one-time funding or one-time revenues with one-time uses and ongoing revenues with ongoing expenses. I'll note that approximately 10% of the proposed fiscal year 23 budget is considered one-time, and that 10% does not grow the tax base into the future. That 10% is primarily comprised of two elements. The first is ARPA. So in May, the City Council evaluated and approved the allocation plan for ARPA proceeds from the federal government. As mentioned in the IBC on that May 24th date, some portion of that ARPA funding was allocated within the present year, and a portion of it is recommended to be used in fiscal year 23. So about $15.2 million in ARPA proceeds are included in the fiscal year 23 general fund budget. Secondly, we have the proactive use of planned fiscal year 22 unallocated funds. We began this kind of strategy as part of the current year budget, as part of an attempt to minimize end of year unallocated funding and ensure that any vacancy savings or higher than budgeted revenues would be allocated on a more proactive basis. So that is included, and there's approximately $14 million of unallocated funds built into this budget. Unallocated current year funds built into next year's budget. The next theme I'll hit on is property tax relief. And I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail on property taxes later in the presentation. But at a high level, this budget includes base growth of 2.45% rather than the max allowable 3%. Looking back since the beginning of the pandemic, that places the average growth at 1.8%, approximately 60% of the allowable amount. And I'll note that base growth is the primary source of funding for ongoing cost increases, and inflation and cost increases will also be a theme that we'll talk about throughout this presentation. Also on the property tax relief theme, there is $1.2 million in property tax relief for community members that participate in the circuit breaker program. That is a one-time allocation, and deeper in the presentation, I'll go through some proposed parameters of that. The fiscal year 23 proposed budget aims to provide a response to growth that the community is experiencing. Some examples, not all inclusive, but some examples of that include funding for the construction of Fire Station 13 in the northwest portion of the city. Various parks investments. We can think about staffing at Zoo Boise, the construction of a new park, Primrose Park. There are numerous investments in public safety staffing and also support department staffing in response to growth at the airport and our water renewal fund. Some quick highlights on growth. Idaho has led all states in year-over-year percentage population growth from calendar year 2020 to calendar year 2021 at just under 3%, 2.9%. Looking at the MSA and the city of Boise in particular, specifically, the MSA has grown by approximately 17% over the last 5 years, with the city of Boise growing about 6.5%. And when you consider Boise's status in the region as, really the economic driver and cultural center, this means that more and more people are living, working, and playing within the city of Boise. The next set of themes I'll go over is response to community priorities. Most definitely, there are significant investments included in public safety, and I'll specifically outline those investments when we get to the general fund expenditures section. We also have investments in housing. I mentioned earlier that housing shortage, and that's definitely been a theme. So there are investments to address that. Transportation is a high community priority. This budget does address that through investments to Valley Regional Transit, our public transportation system, pathways, and other. And then also climate. This budget includes investments to further climate innovation goals and climate action goals. A significant amount of that is funded through ARPA receipts. In terms of responding to inflation, the recommendation to provide property tax relief both through the circuit breaker rebate program as well as taking less than the maximum allowable amount. A good portion of that approach was in response to inflationary impacts that community members are feeling. When we developed the fiscal year 23 budget and we looked at M&O, or maintenance and operations, we looked at discretionary versus non-discretionary accounts, and largely held held discretionary accounts at no growth. And I can speak a little bit more to that as we go through this. When we developed the budget for the capital fund, we did a couple of things in response to inflation. One is we adjusted project estimates, in some cases quite considerably up, in response to what we're seeing out in the market. There's also a recommendation to increase our development impact fees effective October to catch up and reflect the current construction environment. There is a recommendation for an economic uncertainty reserve included as part of the 23 budget as one of our operating contingencies. That economic uncertainty reserve could be available if inflation continues to go down the path that it has, and we see certain cost elements within the city be above and beyond what's currently budgeted.
Madam Mayor, is that what I call
Yes.
you?
Go
here?
ahead, Council.
Eric, thank you. Is that new? The Economic Uncertainty Reserve, is that a new fund?
Councilmember, yes, it is the first time we've included that as part of the budget. I will mention that we have included like type things. If you go back about 2 years when COVID first started to hit us, we did put in a COVID contingency because there were some unknown impacts associated with that. So it's a kind of a similar approach here.
Eric, I had a quick question about the M&O funding. I think it's the right thing to do this year. Having gone through the recession, I know that at about this halfway through the first year, we had to actually completely redo how we looked at M&O and redo the formulas we were using, the projections we were using. So I just want to flag that. I don't think you were here then. You were maybe if you were brand new. And it seems like something that we'll have to watch really closely so that we don't get behind on M&O.
Absolutely. And I might just dwell on that for a brief moment here. And I'll offer a couple of things on that. One is when we developed our long-term forecast, we certainly did build in some of these inflationary impacts. So hopefully the recommendations consider growth, in our maintenance and operations. So hopefully we don't get into that type of situation. And then the other thing, just for clarification for folks that might be watching, I think sometimes when we say maintenance and operations, it might be a little confusing because we have maintenance and operations and we have major repairs and maintenance. So major repairs and maintenance are things like playground reconstruction, repairs to the green belt, repairs to our pool system, things like that. We very much are not reducing our major repairs and maintenance funding. As a matter of fact, you'll see in a slide later that we're increasing the amount of funding we're allocating to major repairs and maintenance so as not to cause a bubble down the line.
And I'll just jump in here, Madam President. This is really important because as we saw in an earlier slide, we're also addressing and responding to the growth that the Valley and our city is experiencing. So we want to both make sure that we're recognizing that costs could rise by having the uncertainty reserve similar to what we did during COVID when we weren't sure if we'd have additional healthcare costs. And then we also have to make sure in this moment of growth that we aren't creating a larger bubble down the line, because the last thing we want to see is disinvestment in the services and quality of life in our community as we're growing, and then kick the can down the road for somebody else to take care of.
Thank you.
The next theme I'll talk about is stabilization of the workforce, and that was certainly a theme that was talked about at length at the May 24th budget workshop. Numerous strategies, including the employee compensation approach that was approved by the City Council on June 7th. There are some targeted staffing augmentations, and then numerous measures. An example of that could be our facilities maintenance consolidation. Some specific strategies and investments, again, just talking about the American Rescue Plan. 15.2 million in the general fund is recommended. There is also funding included within our housing funds and our capital fund, utilizing that American Rescue Plan funding, investments towards affordable housing, climate action, and a series of other community needs. This budget includes investments in safety and security, both police and fire staffing, police and fire equipment and capital infrastructure, security at City Hall and the library, and also cybersecurity investments. There are investments in programs and services for the community, and throughout the budget book, and we'll touch on some of these. You can find investments for parks and recreation, library, planning and development services, and arts and history. And along with that, when our public safety departments grow, or some of those other community-facing departments grow, support departments also need to grow to provide services enabling those other departments' success. So there are investments in legal, IT, finance, and human resources included as part of this budget. There are numerous accounting changes related to housing activities included as part of this budget. So previously programmed funding that was accounted for in the capital fund is recommended to be transferred to the housing funds to provide a more clear depiction of what is available for housing. There's also a one-time transfer from the general fund for housing activities. There's a $1.65 million one-time allocation for our portfolio planning process. Projects that go through this process come to the City Council through interim budget changes. This is a practice we began as part of this current fiscal year, and we are recommending to continue into fiscal year 23. A little bit on maintenance and operation funding, just a little bit more on that. I mentioned that there's no growth in discretionary accounts. Part of the reason why our maintenance and operation funding is recommended to be held flat in many other places is because of our high level of vacancies that we're experiencing. And as we have high vacancy levels, it has impacted our ability to execute on all of our plans and spend the maintenance and operation funding that we have spent in the past. So I might look at our maintenance and operation approach as a one-year kind of hold in many places, but in the outer years, assuming we get to a lower vacancy level, our forecast allows for growth. While I'm talking about vacancy levels, I'll just give a quick little nugget and we can go deeper into that if need be. Typically, we plan for approximately 3 to 4% vacancies. If you look in our general fund right now, we're hovering somewhere around, depending on the department, but in total around 11 to 13%. So we're at a very high level of vacancies. Some of those vacancy savings have been programmed into fiscal year 23, again, as a one-time measure, not in an ongoing, not an ongoing approach. We aim to fill those positions, but realizing that it will probably take some time to get to a more historical level of vacancies. We have included some of those vacancy savings into this budget. The 23 budget includes a continuation of our practice of budgeting 5% of our property tax budget for our public transportation system, Valley Regional Transit. The fiscal year 23 allocation is about $300,000 higher than it was in fiscal year 22. And that $300,000 is attributable to the property tax growth included in this budget.
Eric, just a quick note on that for other council members. When we approved this 5%, I think it was our intent to ensure that Valley Regional Transit did see the same natural growth that we saw as a city, and this tracks with that. Absolutely, 3.5% growth. Thank you.
Thank you. In the budget book, there was also, you might have read a write-up about our cash flow reserve. And I have a slide to demonstrate this a little bit better, but there is one-time savings included in this budget from a revised strategy for making our cash flow reserve reservation. Council President, you had asked, references around the recession, how we might respond. This is probably the first place that we'll see that is we do have tools available to respond to changing economic conditions, should that happen. We have our unallocated operating contingency at $550,000. We have our economic uncertainty reserve that we're recommending. That's a $500,000 amount. We can always draw upon our cash flow reserve in the short term if need be. We have vacancies. So, we could always look at the pace at which we're hiring. Right now, we're hoping to fill vacancies. If things were to dramatically shift, we could look at that again. And we also have our annual transfer to the capital fund. And we could look to that annual transfer and maybe reprioritize timing and projects that are included to be funded out of that. Moving on to a citywide summary of funding. This pie chart shows expenditure funding by fund type. You can see enterprise funds make up about 42% of our $862 million proposed budget. Enterprise funds, I'll go into what those are in a moment. 36% general fund, 12% capital funds, and 10% other funds. I'll note that this slide and the subsequent slides I'll show you within this section are net of the contingent appropriation. The contingent appropriation is included within the budget. It's $320 million. That really represents budget authority to enable projects that were approved in prior years to carry over to subsequent years, or in this case, to carry over into fiscal year 23. We'll see that in December when the council reviews the end of year report and associated rebudget and encumbrance report from the current fiscal year. We have seen a heightened level of investment in our capital program, and we've also seen a heightened level of vacancies, which has resulted in delays in some instances in our capital projects. So those two things have resulted in the need to increase our contingent appropriation. The other thing that we use our contingent appropriation for are grants that we may receive throughout the year. So throughout the course of this year, there's been numerous draws on our contingent appropriation for things like emergency rental assistance program or the ARPA program. So that contingent appropriation allows the city to recognize and allocate those proceeds. So looking at our expenses, again, net of the contingent appropriation, the general fund recommended budget for fiscal year 23 is approximately $306 million. The general fund includes operating costs associated with our general government services. So you can think about public safety, police and fire, recreational services. You can think about cultural services, the library, and arts and history. And you can also think about all the support functions, finance, IT, human resources that support those various departments. Our capital funds representing 12% of our proposed budget at $105.6 million. Our capital funds support infrastructure projects, major equipment and major repairs for general government functions. When we think about that category, we can think about things like fire stations, parks, software implementations in many instances. We can also think about fire engines, parks maintenance vehicles, and major repairs to our green belt and other such assets. Enterprise funds at 42% or $365.1 million. This includes operating and capital costs for our airport, geothermal, solid waste, and water renewal funds. The enterprise funds are not tax supported. They are primarily supported by our service users. And then other funds at about $85 million. There's a wide variety of funds that are included within that category. Debt service fund, our risk and workers' compensation funds, our health fund, housing, and our fleet fund.
Eric, quick question. On the enterprise funds, I assume over the next few years, we'll see some fluctuation in that because of the extensive construction projects that will be going on at both the airport and the water renewal system?
That is correct. I would expect to see a heightened level of investment for the next several years.
Yeah, I just wanted to alert the public if they see that go way up or then come back down. It's really when the bonds are let and those expenditures are first made, right?
Correct.
Thank you.
Yes. Looking at our expenditures by category. So the last presentation was by fund. This one is by category. You can see that there's three roughly or relatively similar sized pie slices here. Personnel representing about 28% of the fiscal year 23 proposed budget. That is all salaries and benefit costs associated with both permanent and temporary city positions. We have our maintenance and operation at $320 million. That'll include things like supplies, utilities, insurance, contracts for services, contingencies, transfers between funds, things like that. And capital and equipment at $302 million. Again, that's capital projects and major equipment. This category here includes both governmental and enterprise functions. So things at the airport and our water renewal fund, plus our general government functions like fire, police, parks, so on and so forth. I'll now start working through our general fund revenues.
Any questions by council? Any general questions before we start? Okay, great. Go ahead. Okay.
The fiscal year 23 general fund revenue, I mentioned this earlier, it's about 90% ongoing funding sources. 10% of our fiscal year 23 budget is dedicated to one-time uses and is supported by one-time funds. $14.5 million from current year unallocated funds that we project to be available, and then $15.2 million from the American Rescue Plan. If we exclude the American Rescue Plan and exclude growth in development fees and department revenue, which are largely reimbursement based, the year-over-year growth in general fund revenues is 3.4%. So I think the top line number in the budget, showed if you just look at overall revenues, it was approximately 10.5%. But again, a significant portion of that is one-time in nature. And then when you reduce the growth in those reimbursement categories, it's approximately 3.4%. Looking at the general fund revenues by category, you can see that our fiscal year 23 revenue in the general fund is 57% supported from property taxes. It's a little bit less than it's been in the past, partially attributable to some of the relief measures, also attributable to the one-time funding that's included as part of this budget. Sales tax makes up about 8%, ARPA 5%, our carrier forward being 5%. You can see department revenue at 10%, and I have a slide to demonstrate what that is. Development fees at 5% and internal charges at 4%.
Eric, quick question on that 57%, because that really caught my eye. We've not been below 60% in the time that I've been on city council that I remember. Absent the ARPA and the one time, are we in the same range we would be otherwise, or is it trending down anyway?
I can get that answer for you before we depart today. I would suspect that we're approximately in the same level, but I'll get that for you. Sure. When we look at general fund revenues, you can see here on the left-hand side of this table, you can see the FY23 amounts by category. You can see growth in sales tax from 21.4 million to 24 million. As part of our quarterly reports that Mike has brought to the council, we've been reporting on the fact that we've been receiving more growth this year than was assumed. We had assumed that we'd be at 1% cap. We've been able, at least for the first 2 quarters, to receive full growth. We have then programmed 1% growth from the first 2 quarters of full growth into fiscal year 23. It remains to be seen if we'll get the full growth in quarters 3 and 4 of this fiscal year.
Eric, sorry to keep interrupting, but I did have a quick question on that. Are we at a point where it would be worth going back to the state and asking if people have equalized, given that new formula, and take the cap away?
I think that there are still a number of cities that are below that cap. I know that when the legislation was approved that put that cap into place at 1%, there was a thought that it might be, a 5 to 7 year period before there was an equalization. We have seen higher growth than I think was anticipated when that cap was put into place, which might speed up, that equalization process. I know there are still a number of cities that are below it, but I would expect that within the next year or two, the state should be looking at that and removing that cap, so there's not this variability from year to year.
Thank you. I just wanted to put that on the radar of both the city, and I will take that to the Association of Idaho Cities as well.
Thank you. You can see development fees from our fiscal year 22 estimate growing from 12.5 million to 14.8 million. Franchise fees being largely flat. Liquor tax with just a little bit of growth as well. Some fairly healthy growth in our departmental revenue from 29.4 million to 32.5 million, and flat in our fines and forfeitures. Let me speak a little bit to development fees and departmental revenue, because those are 2 of our larger growing categories. Those categories, I think, are reflecting similar dynamics. The first dynamic would be that when we brought forward the current year budget, there was still some uncertainty about the economic climate and what COVID might do to our receipts and things of that nature. Participation levels, construction levels, so on and so forth. We've seen, obviously health in those areas. So these estimates are largely recognizing the present state. It's not necessarily saying that we are increasing rates or anything like that to generate those revenues. The other thing I'll mention is that both of those categories, I spoke to this earlier, are reimbursement based. So the growth in those categories aren't necessarily available for all government functions. What this does do, though, is provide for a higher level of cost recovery in related functions. On the right-hand side of this table, I've notated kind of the city's ability to impact collections on a year-over-year basis within these categories. So sales tax, there's really no ability to effectuate changes in terms of what we collect. The sales tax rate is set by the state. It's 6%. Also, sales tax receipts are pooled at the statewide level and distributed per formula. So it's not like revenues generated in the city of Boise, dollar for dollar, stay within the city of Boise. So that category really can't be impacted by city action on a year-over-year basis. Development fees, there certainly is some element of ability to adjust, but I would say that it's more highly correlated to the health and the economy. So as investment in local construction is high, we'll see high level of revenue there, or higher level of cost recovery. And then when things go down, you'll see it dip. Franchise fees are long-term agreements that aren't renegotiated each year. Our receipts are based on consumption and usage patterns. Our liquor tax is distributed to us directly from the state. Department revenue, there is some ability, through rate changes and program offerings and things like that. But I'll again reinforce that these are reimbursement based. And then fines and forfeitures, very minimal. Moving into property tax. I'll just do an overview and then we'll kind of dig in a little bit deeper. The fiscal year 23 budget estimate is $175.4 million. It's just south of 3.5% growth year over year. That growth is made up of 2.45% base growth, again, in contrast to the 3% growth, which is allowable. And the way we look at that is the growth in property tax, the base growth in property tax is largely used for cost increases on our existing services. So as the things that we buy and the employees that we employ rise in cost, we look to our property tax base increases, again, less than the maximum. And then new construction at 1%. The cities are allowed to take new construction, property tax on new construction. And that is a way for the city to support services associated with growth, or another way of saying growth paying for growth. We have a property tax rebate program, again, included in this budget. There is no use of foregone property taxes. So in years prior, the city has elected to take no increase going back to fiscal year 2021. And there's no usage of that included as part of this budget. And our overall growth of 3.5% is well below the 8% cap that was established in calendar year 2021 by the state legislature. So looking at the levy rate and the assessed taxable value, first I'll speak to the levy rate. The levy rate that is applied and is used to determine how much any individual property pays in taxes is based on a formula. And that formula is the general fund property tax amount. In fiscal year 23, it's 175.2. I know I mentioned 175.4 on the prior slide. The $200,000 is what we call our property tax contingency. So the plan would be to levy for 175.2 million. You divide that by the net taxable market value. And for fiscal year 23, the net taxable market value is projected to be $48.6 billion. The product of that equation is a levy rate of 0.0036. Looking at the numerator and the denominator in that equation, the 175.2 million, or the general fund property tax amount, can only increase by up to 3% per year, plus an allowance to account for new construction. And the taxable market value has been increasing very, very rapidly. It's up about 32% from a year ago. So we were at 32% approximately when we were heading into the fiscal year 22 budget. Now we're at 48 billion.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
Eric, is that why the levy rate has fallen? It was, I don't remember the number, but it was substantially higher last year and the year before, right?
Absolutely. So when we see, Councilmember, thank you for the question. When we see the property tax, or the taxable valuation increase, there's usually a correlating decrease on the levy rate, and you can see that represented on the chart here on the right. The red line, or the orange line, represents the taxable value, and you can see that it's been on an upward trajectory ever since 2013, albeit at a much higher rate since about 2018. And then you can see the blue line, which is our levy rate, which has been falling almost at an equal rate over time. One other note I'll make about that, about the declining levy rate, is that it has an impact on new construction revenues that the city can realize. So for fiscal year 23, there's a very similar amount of new construction revenue that we anticipate being able to be taxed as was realized 1 year ago, about $550 million. The difference though, however, is that $500 million in investment in new taxable property is going to generate approximately $2 million in property tax receipts for fiscal year 23, whereas last year it was about 2.5 million. So the levy rate reduces the ability to receive taxes from new construction. So that becomes particularly important, obviously on an annual basis as we're seeking to ensure growth pays for growth, but also when we do our projections for the future and look at retiring urban renewal districts.
Eric, follow up on that. There's been a lot of conversation about what can we do about property taxes. I know, years ago, our property tax levy rate was capped at 1%. And during the recession, we got actually very close to our cap because of declining market value. And now with this increasing market value, I think at least in my mind, it sort of creates this disconnect between what is the real driver of property tax increases. Is it the levy rate, which people think capping it at 1% was the solution, or is it this mismatch between the exemptions and the various properties and how they're assessed? And it seems to me to be the latter, and I think this actually illustrates that even more as I've been thinking about it.
Thank you very much, Council President. I would agree with that, and I'll show some slides that might drive that home a little bit.
Madam Mayor,
Yes, go ahead.
I just had a question/comment along the same lines as folks are getting their assessments and kind of talking about how property taxes are changing. One of the things that has come up several times in conversations is, well, why don't we just charge a different levy rate for commercial property versus residential property? Can you talk a little bit about that and what the rules are around the levy rate and how it applies to all properties?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. We would not have the option to use a separate levy rate for commercial versus residential properties. The Idaho State Constitution requires that property tax be applied uniformly. So the levy rate is applied to commercial or residential, regardless of asset type, in the same way. So the Constitution would need to be amended for that.
One more follow-up on that. We've talked a lot about the homeowner's exemption and how indexing it and increasing the allowable value might impact residential growth. Over the years, isn't it true that commercial property used to have both a pretty significant inventory tax and or a personal business property tax that was also applied to their assessed value, and those have been exempted. And so has that exacerbated this split between the increase in residential and the sort of decrease in commercial valuation?
Council President, yes, I have to say that has a part of it. I can't speak to the exact amount of that like I can in some of the other things, but it's certainly part of the dynamic.
Madam Mayor.
Yes,
Thank you.
Councilmember Sanchez.
Thank you, Eric. So what is the tipping point if we don't, and I say we as in the grand we, if we don't do something to change this trajectory?
In terms of how do we effectuate a change here?
Yeah, what's the cliff here if we don't change direction, if we don't make changes, if there's not a new formula adopted?
Council member, that's a difficult question to answer, but what I can say is that, and I'll show in some subsequent slides, the impact to individual homeowners, and we make various illustrations out of the average priced home in Boise, and you'll see the increases that they're experiencing. And at some point, it's going to be very difficult for people to make those payments and to hang on to their homes.
Great. Thank you, Eric.
So this slide demonstrates the average residential property in Boise, and there's going to be a few illustrations of that average home. And you can see that the blue line represents how much of that home is subject to property tax. Going back to 2016, about 58% of that home was subject to property tax after the homeowner's exemption. Fast forward to today, that average home, about 78% of the assessed value would be subject to property tax. And that's largely because of what's happening on that orange line. That orange line is the homeowner's exemption. You can see that it was fixed in 2016 at $100,000, stayed there through last year, where it was increased to $125,000, but there was no accommodation made for future growth. So it wasn't indexed, and it will not increase absent any other subsequent change from the legislature to keep up with assessed value increases. You can see that on the right-hand side, the assessed value growth for the average home since 2016 has been about 166%, whereas the growth in the homeowner's exemption has been just south of 40%. I'll go through the average homeowner impact, and then I'll show some charts to help drive home the point that we're seeing here. This is a presentation that we show every year, and I think it's a valuable one. And it shows 1 year to the next the changes in assessed values, levy rates, and the impact of taking or not taking a 0 or 3% increase. You can see on line 2 in fiscal year 22, the assessed value of the average priced home in the city of Boise was $440,000, just a little bit more than $440,000.
Eric, I'm going to interrupt you real quick. For those of you following along in your book, this is page 111.
Thank you. I missed that on the header. Thanks. In fiscal year 23, $564,000 for the average priced home. So in 1 year, the average assessed value home has increased by 28.2%. The exemption fixed at $125,000, which results in the taxable value increasing at a rate higher than the assessed value change. So the taxable value on the average priced home is up by 39.3%. There's the dynamic of the levy rate declining, which we went over a few slides ago. So the levy rate, reducing by 21.4%, but the city taxes would increase by 9.5% if the city elected to take a 3% increase. And that 9.5% increase in city taxes would correlate to $137.65. We also do a comparison to say what would happen if the city took 0%. So lines 8 through 15 demonstrate that. Lines 9, 10, and 11 are the same as up above. Line 12 represents the levy rate if the city were to have opted to take a 0%, and it would be a 23.7% levy rate decline. City taxes would still go up on that average priced home by 6.3%, or $91.30. So the difference on the average priced home from taking 0% or 3% attributable to strictly that dynamic, the 0% or 3%, would be $46.35. The fiscal year 23 budget, however, recommends a lower amount than the 3%. It includes a recommendation for 2.45% growth. That 2.45% growth results in the levy rate that's shown on line 20. So about 21.8% less than the fiscal year 22 levy rate. And if you look at lines 23 and 24, you can see that the savings from taking 2.45% versus 3% on the average homeowner for city taxes is $8.50, or another way to say that, the cost of taking the 2.45% base growth on the average home would be $37.85.
Madam Mayor. Eric, I want to put a finer point on something that I think I just heard you say, and I'm going to say it simply, and hopefully this is correct, because I think this is worth having the conversation and having people understand. From what I just heard, that the city of Boise could not raise its budget a dime and my property taxes could go up based on the formula.
That is correct.
And I think that, Madam President, this is.
Yes, go ahead.
I think it's, the next question is, well, how or why? And because it's not that it's just the money's coming out of thin air, the money's shifting. So in a couple slides, we'll see, and we discussed this at the last budget workshop in May, and we discussed it even more when the assessor came to visit, the impact in that chart that we'll see of the shift of the bulk of payments from being equalized between commercial and residential owners, and shifting so drastically. So that $42, let's say, if I remember the amount right from, on my slide, it's so, on my screen, this is so tiny. But that money that would be paid even if we took 0%, so didn't account for rising costs, what in the past would have been paid most likely by a commercial property. And because of the way assessments are done, it's now being shifted, and that's being paid by a residential property owner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. That is correct, and I will show that a little bit deeper here. So this slide shows burden shift within the city of Boise, and you can see we show this slide each year, and each year the gap widens. You can see that in 2020, residential and commercial, the residential sector and the commercial sector each paid about half of the overall burden of property taxes within the city of Boise. As a matter of fact, commercial was just a little bit higher than residential. Subsequent to that, we've seen quite a drastic rate of separation. And fast forwarding to today, we're looking at approximately 74% of the overall property tax burden being borne by the residential sector, and just a little bit less than 26% being borne by the commercial sector. There has been, we've done an analysis to look at this to say, is it attributable to just more residential construction? Because that would be a plausible explanation. But when we look at actual construction within the city, it's relatively equal between residential and commercial. So I think using an explanation saying, well, we just have more residential doesn't really hold for the city of Boise, at least.
Madam Mayor.
Yes.
So Eric, I've gone to your college, your budget college. I'm still in 100 level courses, so bear with me. But I think the mayor's question about the why is really important here, because the numbers are very, very clear. So why has this happened in the last 20 years?
There's a couple of explanations. The two primary explanations are, one, the homeowner exemption not keeping up. So as more and more of residential property values are subject to taxation for property taxation, there is a corresponding relief to commercial properties. The second thing is year over year, we're seeing a split in terms of the rate of appreciation for residential properties versus commercial properties. even as part of this year. If we look at some top line numbers, residential increasing, approximately 30%, commercial approximately 21%. So they're growing at different rates when it comes to their assessments, which means that the residential are picking up more and more, and exacerbating that is the diminishing value of that homeowner's exemption.
Madam Mayor. So Eric, I'll see if I get my test question right, because I know I've asked you this before, but is the differentiation between commercial and residential assessments, is that because residential turns over more and commercial doesn't? And so we have a better, there's more of a fluid assessment there versus commercial?
Yeah, I mean, I think the assessor could speak to that a little bit better, but most certainly the assessor has access to MLS listings and can see in real time what is happening, where there's certainly far fewer commercial properties that are turning over on an annual basis.
Sure, Madam Mayor, I'd like to add to this conversation a little bit. So one of the differences between, and when the assessor came, this was one of the things that he told us on residential properties. And I'm sorry, I have such a terrible frog in my throat today, so I'm going to be continually clearing my throat. On residential properties, they have access to MLS data. So you know exactly how much those are selling for, exactly what the market value is. On commercial properties, the formula is much different. So they're assessing commercial properties based on the income of what that property produces. And so it's not based on market value of the property. It's based on the income of that property. And so it's so different. The commercial reporting is very cloudy. It's not as transparent as what we have for residential properties. And so like, it felt to me that when the assessor came to present to us, the commercial picture is just very cloudy, very convoluted because of the way that those values are determined, where the residential property, like, we know what that is. We know how much those are selling for. So I think that's a really big part of it.
Thank you, Council President Pro Tem. Isn't it also true, Eric, remind me that Idaho law does not require disclosure of sale prices. Many states do require that disclosure. And so because of the disparity, because we see the MLS listings, and even though we may not know the exact sale price, we know what it was listed for. We know how quickly it sold. It's pretty transparent what the price was. On commercial property, there's just literally no information. Is that true?
That is correct.
And state law could be changed to require that disclosure, but so far that hasn't been successful.
That is correct.
Thank you.
This is a topic that came up, I think the last time we worked through property taxes, which is the compounding impact of burden shift. So there's kind of a lot to this slide, so I'll walk through it. If you look at the graph on the left, there are three sections. There's a gray section, a blue section, and then a peach colored section. That gray section represents what basically the baseline. So what city taxes were on the average priced home in 2013. And the amount for that was $661. So for the purposes of this graph, I've carried that $661 across the 10-year period here. Then I show in blue how much the cumulative impact would be if the city taxes on that average size home only increased by the percent that the city takes as part of its base growth, between 0 and 3%. And you can see in 2014, I apologize, it's kind of small, but it was $20. So a 3% increase on that $660 would have been a $20 increase. But that wasn't the only increase that average homeowner felt. That average priced home saw an increase of $94. So that the $74 difference is represented in peach. And that, I think that's really the burden shift. That is taxes that were not attributable to the growth in the city's budget, attributable to some other factor, higher rate of assessment, homeowners exemption, whatever it might be. And you can see as you move across this chart that it increases each year. So in 2015, it would have been a cumulative $40 impact if it was just the 3% plus the 3%, but in actuality, it was $198. All the way across, you get to fiscal year 2020, and had taxes tracked with just the city's increase, that average priced home would have seen an increase of $152. Instead, it saw an increase of $658, so a $506 increase attributable to burden shift. In 2021, we see that number go down, and that number went down because of the one-time property tax relief program that the city participated in. It was a state program utilizing federal resources to effectively provide property tax relief. So the amount of burden shift that year was, cumulative burden shift was brought down from $506 to $308. You can see the city amount stayed flat, again, because of a 0% increase. Last year, there was a 3% increase, which would have brought us to $176. And then this year, $197, another $21. You can see in fiscal year 23 that burden shift amount has grown to over $700 on the average home. Some stats on the right-hand side of this slide. The city taxes on the average home have increased by 139% since 2013, with approximately 80% of that being attributable to burden shift. That burden shift is attributable to two primary factors. I mentioned earlier, first, the diminishing value of the homeowner's exemption. Secondly, the rate of assessed increase for residential for commercial properties. And final note, had taxes on the average home tracked with the annual budget increases of between 0 and 3%, the average home would have seen a much lower cumulative increase of $197. Okay. Another depiction of burden shift within the city of Boise. So whereas the previous slide was really just looking singularly at that average priced home, this slide brings in some commercial properties. And what this slide does is looks at growth in taxes on the average priced home versus two big box retailers within city limits. The way we'd look at big box retailers are large retail establishments, typically over 50,000 square feet. You could consider big box retailers having general merchandise, things like groceries, food, even things like toys and sporting goods, or you could also look at specialty type big box retailers that might include like home repair, books, or electronics. We've selected two big box retailers, and we looked at what's happened over time. So let me walk through this chart a little bit. So first I'll speak to the blue, and you can see behind the green is a blue space which represents the cumulative annual growth in Boise property tax collections since 2012. So anywhere between 0 and 3%, and then it adds another 0 to 3% the next year, so on and so forth. By fiscal year 22, over a 10-year period, we're approximately 26% of cumulative growth. The green bar shows cumulative growth on the average priced home. And you can see that starting in 2013, it was higher than the orange and the yellow bar. And that continues throughout this 10-year period. So much so that by fiscal year 23, taxes on the average home increased by 139%. Now, when we look at those two real life examples of big box retailers, the first one saw a 13.9% decrease over a 10-year period in terms of what it paid. The second one was a 6.7% decrease in real dollars in terms of what it paid. So while we're seeing rapid escalation in terms of what the average homeowner is paying on a year-over-year basis for property taxes, at least in this example, we're seeing commercial properties not only staying flat, but actually reducing what they're paying over time. A key takeaway from this chart is that when property taxes on any individual property increases on a percentage basis more than the city's overall collection on a percentage basis, it means that some other property is paying less. So when we talk about burden shift, that's really, kind of a synthesized version of it. We're seeing some properties, largely residential properties, pay more and more and more each year, and we're seeing actual reductions in commercial payments.
That's such a good point, Eric. And it's one that really, like, we talk about burden shift because it hurts residential property owners as their property taxes go through the roof. But it's a coin with two sides, and burden shift, if it's shifting onto you, it's shifting off of someone else. So if your property taxes are going up by more than about 3%, somebody else's property taxes are going down. Somebody is paying less and less each year while you're paying more and more.
Eric, quick point about that. I hear a lot from various legislators that increasing the homeowner's exemption would create a shift. And we shouldn't do it because it would shift property taxes to commercial. But what you're saying is that, in fact, it would equalize it back to what it used to be if we made that. The shift has already happened. We're just trying to get back.
That's correct. There is a shift that is happening right now. And we're seeing, by virtue of this gap widening each year, property tax burden is shifting from residential property owners from commercial to residential property owners. And that gap continues to widen. So there is a shift. So, to the degree that, there would be an increase to the homeowner's exemption, ideally it would bring these two lines at least moving closer to each other as opposed to moving apart.
Madam Mayor.
Yes, Councilmember Sanchez.
So Eric, I remember when the assessor was here and did a lot of explanation for us to help us understand why this is the case. And a lot of it came down to we're able to get more information when it comes to residential property as opposed to commercial property. So my question is, I know that, one thing that I've appreciated about our different departments doing presentations before us is oftentimes we'll see a chart with different comparable cities that we can compare Boise to. And I'm wondering, is this a nationwide move that commercial properties engage in where they try to shirk their tax responsibility, or is this unique to Idaho? And if it isn't, can we guesstimate, can we look at a comparable city where the commercial property is paying their tax burden adequately? And if our commercial were to pay their fair share, what would that look like? I think it would be compelling to the taxpayers to see how much money commercial property is pocketing as opposed to our residential property owners when it comes to the tax burden. So I hope I made sense with my question there.
Madam Mayor, I'll jump in here because part of that question I think isn't appropriate for Eric to have to answer because it's not whether or not commercial properties are shirking responsibility. And that's the piece that, Eric is not the assessor. He's attempting to share with us, how the shift has happened and what that means for residents. So what we know to be true in our local situation, and the way taxes are developed are, created by the state, is that as the charts have shown, is that there's been a shift, a naturally occurring shift because of the dictates from the state in terms of how the homeowner's exemption is or isn't indexed. It's not, it's just a flat $125,000. The lack of transparency to provide data for the assessor to impact growth in commercial assessments, and then the ability to reach in and grab that information from an MLS system for residents to reflect true values at the time. So it's, as the state discusses and this region discusses meaningful property tax relief and reform, these are the things that need to be looked at. Because as Councilmember Bajan said, is I think Councilmember Willits has said, and the Council President Pro Tem as well, these charts are showing that, if one person's not paying for it, somebody else is. And that somebody else right now, because of the way the system is created at the state level and the assessments are done at the county level, are residents of the city of Boise and cities throughout the state.
Madam Mayor.
Thank you.
Yeah, just kind of
Councilmember
follow-up
Halliburton.
question there. And Eric, maybe this is an easier way to answer that question. If we were in Salt Lake City right now, or if we were in Fort Collins, would we be seeing sort of a similar slide, or is this really unique to where we're at?
Unfortunately, council member, I probably couldn't answer that question because I'm not as up to speed on the complexities of, other states' property tax systems. So I'd probably decline to answer that one.
Yeah,
Apologize.
Madam Mayor,
I can
one
look
more
into it,
time.
though.
Maybe, is this a trend that seems kind of unique to here? Is it a trend that we might see across the country?
That could certainly be something that we look at in the future. I can certainly speak to what's happening in Idaho, and we're seeing, a very dramatic difference in terms of rate of assessments here.
Sure. Thank you.
Yep.
Madam Mayor. I don't, want to go too far into the weeds, but one other thing that we need to think about with burden shift is the way that different types of property are valued. So the assessor applies 3 different formulas to all property: an income approach, a cost approach, and a market valuation approach, and then produces the value. Because there's not good data, or supposedly not good data, on the market value of commercial property, the assessor relies on the income approach. How much money does that property generate? One of the problems is that you can think about real estate in Boise like a very expensive car, like a Lamborghini. So if you have a person driving a Lamborghini for Uber who makes $20,000 and they use the income approach to value their Lamborghini, it's going to be a capitalization on $20,000. That's the issue with commercial property. The Lamborghinis on the commercial side are being valued for the revenue that they generate, while the Lamborghinis on the residential side are being valued for what they would sell for. The assessor should apply all 3 of those formulas. And if it's a lack of data on the market transactions of commercial real estate, that could be a problem. But that valuation difference, the way the property is valued, plays into this as well.
Thank you, council member. Yeah, there certainly is interesting ways that commercial properties are assessed. One thing I'll note on this slide is that we did look at the health of some of these big box retailers over time and income. And while we don't have specifics on a store-to-store level, we looked at the overall health, and these big box retailers are from, if you were to take a strict income approach at the company-wide level, are quite healthy.
I think we can move on.
So after kind of talking a lot about some of the negative impacts on property taxes, we'll now kind of go through the property tax rebate program, which is proposed as part of this budget to offer some additional relief. There was a bill that was approved as part of this most recent legislative session, HB 550, that allows cities to provide a property tax rebate That ability did not exist previously. The fiscal year 23 budget includes 1.2 million to fund a one-time rebate for eligible community members. The goal is to use the same parameters as included in the state's property tax reduction program, oftentimes referred to as the circuit breaker program. For this to happen, per HB 550, the city council must pass an ordinance detailing how much is available for that program, application instructions, as well as a deadline formula for determining the rebate amount, as well as calling out the method of distribution and any other measures necessary to administer the rebate program. The goal would be for the city council to approve that ordinance by September of 2022. So we'd anticipate having dialogue with the city council over the summer months on that potential ordinance. We know that the circuit breaker recipients aren't finalized until the fourth Monday in October. So the folks that would be eligible to participate in this program will get a listing of that, October 24th or thereabouts. We would propose, because it needs to be an application-based program, doing multiple notifications to our circuit breaker participants and enabling them to apply for this program. Payments would then be made subsequent to the second property tax payment, which is due in June of 2023.
Yeah, go ahead.
Eric, I'm very thankful that the legislature gave us this option since it hasn't been available to us before. Real quickly, can you just kind of give a brief overview of who might be eligible for the circuit breaker program? Because I know that currently there are a lot of people eligible at the county level who are not taking advantage. And so I think it would be helpful to just kind of let folks know so that they can maybe mentally prepare to do another application process.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So to be eligible for the circuit breaker program, there are several criteria that must be true. So first and foremost, you must be an Idaho resident. You must own or occupy the home or mobile home in which you're applying for. The home must be, and this is per most recent legislative action, is either valued at $300,000 or 150% of the median assessed value for the county, whichever is greater. So for Ada County, that 150% median value is $801,000. So you have to be an Idaho resident. You can't have a home that exceeds $801,000 in assessed value. Your total income for the calendar year after deducting any medical expenses must be $32,230 or less. And you must meet one of the following criteria, being 65 years of age or older, a former prisoner of war or hostage, blind, widow or widower, or disabled.
I'll just jump in here too. It's our goal to expand access or expand participation in this program. So in addition to passing the ordinance, making sure that this is all moving ahead, we're going to be looking at ways that we can get the word out to residents that do qualify but aren't taking advantage of the program that we would like them to, and make it as easy as possible.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Another element around property taxes is foregone. So by virtue of taking a 2.45% versus a 3% property tax increase, the city's collections and property tax for fiscal year 23 would be $929,000 less than otherwise allowable. When the city elects to take less than the maximum allowable amount, the city council has the option to declare that amount as foregone. And when any amount not taken is declared as foregone, it allows the city to recover any or all of that amount in a subsequent fiscal year. Currently, our foregone balance is just a little bit under $4.8 million. That's attributable to the fiscal year 21 0% increase that the city council approved. When that 0% increase was approved, there was an accompanying resolution that foregone in the future would not be taken during a recessionary period. There are also limitations that were put into place by the state legislature precluding cities from taking more than 1% per year of foregone for any ongoing purpose. There are currently no plans to utilize this foregone balance. It's not included in any of our forecasting scenarios, but it remains available. Should the city opt to take that foregone, it would be subject to those changes I mentioned that were approved in 2021 and require a public hearing on July 19th.
Thank you, Eric. To that end, we'll need to make a motion at some point during the day to set that public hearing if we decide to go forward with that. Is that correct?
I think some sort of direction would be helpful. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no other questions on property tax, I'll move on to sales tax.
It's 10 o'clock. Why don't we take a quick break and then we'll move on? Can we get everything in if we do it that way? Okay, 10-minute break, no later. Be back here at 10:10.
Kind of halfway, kind of don't do space, but it's nice to have the space. Yeah, I don't know how that
Welcome back. Thank you for allowing us a short break, and we will move into sales tax.
Thank you very much, Council President. Before I go on sales tax, you had asked a question earlier around property taxes and the relative percentage of property taxes within the budget. There was a slide that represented 57% of our budget in fiscal year 23 being generated from sales or from property tax, and you asked if that was a trend, if we were to pull out the one-time revenues. And staff looked at that, and it has been trending down slightly. After several years of it, creeping up, it's been working its way down. If you stripped out those one-time funding sources, we'd be at about 63.5%, where, if you go back, 4 or 5 years, we were closer to 2/3.
Thank you. I really appreciate that information because, yeah, as it got up to 67%, it was becoming pretty concerning about how much we were reliant on it. So it's good to see it trending down. Thank you.
I'll do an overview of a few of our revenue streams looking at sales tax. Our fiscal year 2023 proposed budget, there's a typo there, I apologize, $24 million. The increase from 22 to 23 is to align with recent performance. We have seen, at least in the first 2 quarters of this fiscal year, higher growth than was planned. We would then reset our base and assume 1% growth from there. Each quarter, there's a determination made by the state based on the formula, whether or not any individual city gets full growth or is capped at that 1%. We have seen strong sales tax growth at the statewide level. And the 1% growth recommendation is informed by recent statewide legislation, capping at 1% if you are below the per capita distribution. And we've also seen a portion of sales tax diverted from the pool. Online sales tax is being placed into a property tax relief fund a tax relief fund presently for statewide use, which is reducing the amount that's going into the city and county distribution.
Thank you. And that's actually one of the reasons I brought up the question about whether it's time to review where we are in that revenue distribution and whether the cities who were above per capita versus the ones below per capita had equaled out. I guess I am a little concerned when we get to 2024 and the revenue from the online sales tax is inserted back into the distribution formula. If that hasn't changed, there will be some cities that will get a significant bonus, if you will, from that, and others who will get very little. So it does seem like it's something that we should make sure is on the radar of all of the cities, but especially those of us who are capped so that we don't end up in that position.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And the city of Boise, is kind of in a middle ground where I think that we're going to bounce between full growth and 1%. On maybe not a quarterly, but maybe on an annual basis. And there could be some cities that are well below, but that gap is starting to narrow in terms of that equalization.
Thank you.
Development fees, 23 proposed budget of $14.8 million. The budgeted estimate, similar to sales tax, is recommended to be increased to align with recent performance. Development fees in particular is an economically sensitive revenue category. We're going to monitor this one very carefully. If the economy should shift, if we start to see reductions, we may need to bring balancing recommendations for City Council consideration throughout the course of the year. Last category I'll highlight is our departmental revenues. So departmental revenues are largely reimbursement based. They are largely associated with services provided by individual departments. The 23 proposed budget is $32.4 million. That is a $3.1 million year-over-year increase, with just a little bit over 60% of that increase attributable to Parks and Recreation revenues, reflecting increased participation in program offerings, as well as a similar theme from the prior two categories, aligning with more recent performance. There are a series of fee changes that are called out as part of the budget document in some of our departmental revenue categories. And increases in revenue are really increasing the level of cost recovery. They're not additional, and I'm using air quotes, profit for the city. It's not a profitable service or a venture. So therefore, they're not really available for general use. It's, again, to offset costs of service. When you look at how our departmental revenues generated, approximately 52% from our public safety contracts. You can see on the pie chart on the left, the majority of the other revenues are generated from our parks programs. You can see zoo, Idaho Ice World, golf, cemetery, aquatics, and then even within that, other categories where you'd find things like, some of our sports programming, play camps, things of that nature. Parking representing about 8% of our department revenues. When you look at the public safety contracts, what that represents for our fire department primarily is North Ada County Fire and Rescue, NACFR, Whitney, as well as the airport. And when you look at the police department, that would include service delivery on behalf of Boise State, service delivery at the airport, as well as within the Boise School District. There's no questions on revenues. I'll move on to general fund expenses.
I see no questions. Go ahead.
Thank you, Council President. An overview of general fund expenses, you can see personnel representing about 63.4% of total general fund expenses. That's a fairly typical range. We've been, in the 60 to 62, 64% range for the last several years. Our M&O and major equipment representing about 21.6%, transfers to other funds at 10.4%, and those transfers include our annual capital transfer to housing, as well as debt service. And then we have our annual VRT contribution. It's 2.9% of the overall budget, however, 5% of our property tax estimate.
And Eric, that would probably be above 3% without the 10% one time in this year's budget. Am I correct on that? It's typically run around 3.
That's correct. That number would be a little bit higher than the 2.9.
Thank you.
And then contingencies of about 1.7. As we look at that personnel number, there was a question that was asked at the last workshop about how that breaks down between general employees and contract employees. And you can see that it's roughly equal. General employees, about 52% of that compensation, with our contract employees, 48%. And when you look at that on an FTE basis, our general employee FTEs representing about 61% of the total authorized count, whereas contract FTEs representing about 39%. Looking at M&O, So maintenance and operations, as well as our major equipment, representing about 21.6% of the budget. You can see on the right-hand side of this slide, the largest slice of that pie, excuse me, being ARPA at 23%. Professional and contract services representing 21%, supplies and equipment at 14%, software maintenance 10%. We have some of our maintenance areas of responsibility at about 8%, and insurance at 7%. I'll note that we've seen within our insurance and software maintenance categories pretty strong year-over-year increases, which we have allowed for within our forecast. If we look at the general fund expenditures by department, you can see that public safety makes up just over half of the overall city budget or general fund budget at 50.5%. Parks and Recreation being our next largest department at 14.1%. Our various support departments, HR, IT, finance, and legal, representing 13.9% of the general fund expenditure budget. Our Planning and Development Services Department at 5.6%, Library at 5%, Contractual Services, which includes Valley Regional Transit, as well as our contribution to Allenbaugh House and Idaho Humane Society at 3.6%. When we look at growth trends for general fund positions, first looking at kind of our trends between 2017 and 2020, we were averaging approximately 28 positions per year. In fiscal year 21, there was very minimal FTE additions due to uncertainties around COVID. So as part of last year's budget, there were 44 positions to partially catch up on some of those past hiring deficits. When we look at fiscal year 23, there's 38 positions proposed as part of this budget. There were also some positions approved as part of IBCs. So there were, some project management positions approved as part of our year-end process, some HR positions that were approved via IBC earlier this month. When you look at those plus the 38 positions that are proposed as part of the proposed budget, it gets kind of our average consistent. So if you look at the average between 2017 and 2020, we were averaging about 28.1 positions per year in the general fund. If you look at between fiscal year 2017 and 2021, so capturing the low growth year of 2021 as well as catch-up years of 22 and 23, our 4-year average is more along the lines of what it was from between 17 and 20.
Thank you. Yes, Councilmember Pro Tem.
Thank you, Eric. I have a couple of questions on this one. Does this reflect both contract employees and general employees?
It does.
Okay. And then my next question is, we've been growing generally under 1% per year population-wise in the city of Boise proper for a number of years. Is this proportionate to community growth? Is this growth kind of outsized in personnel, which would then proportionally have an impact on M&O and different things? How does that kind of compare to the growth that the community's seen over these years?
I could come back with some more specific numbers, but I can speak to the fact that the growth that we're seeing in the recommended growth in FTEs is response in part to the population growth that you'll see, but it's also in response to growth that we're seeing in the MSA as various community members from throughout the region utilize city services. It's also in response to growth that we're seeing in our enterprise funds. So as the airport grows, as the one airport in the region, the general fund positions need to be added to support hiring activities and IT and HR activities that are out at the airport. They're reimbursed through our cost allocation plan, But the same dynamic also exists in our water renewal fund. So as we've had to upgrade and do different things, to our various water renewal facilities, there's support functions to come along with that. So the correlation to our population is an important one, but it's probably not the only driver as to why we need to add positions.
Great. I appreciate that analysis.
Eric, I had a quick question. As I was going through this, I was trying to determine which of these positions were going to be funded by revenue growth in the department where they're happening. So for instance, the zoo, the golf position, and I came up with 10 of those, 38 being funded by growth in the revenue of the department. Am I correct on that?
Pretty close. So I actually, on this next slide, I kind of have an analysis of that. So I looked at the 38 positions that are proposed in the general fund. Approximately, 15 and a half of those positions are public safety related. Between police and fire, there's a position in legal, as well as our security positions in our human resources department. I came up with 11 positions that are primarily revenue neutral between the zoo, Idaho Ice World, 3 positions in our planning department, as well as a treasury analyst in Department of Finance. Okay. There are 7 positions in support departments in response to growth in those external facing departments. Those positions are partially supported through the cost allocation plan. In other words, they're supported through enterprise fund reimbursements. And those would be positions in human resources, IT, legal, and the Department of Finance. 2 of the 38 positions support parks, custodial, and events related services. 1 supporting front counter activities, licenses and permits down on the first floor. And then 1 position for the opening of the Irma Heyman House is recommended.
Thank you. That's helpful. One note too, as I understand the proposed fees later, we may be looking at some changes in how we run arts and history so that there is some revenue produced by the tours and stuff, which might help with that position at Irma Heyman. Is that correct?
That's correct. I think the fees are the fee structure is being proposed, because this is the best time to propose that. And I think that over time we can come back with maybe some more specific recommendations and results of those fees being implemented.
Thank you.
I've talked about the public safety investment that's included as part of the 23 budget. 50.5% of our general fund operating budget, or just under $153 million, is dedicated towards public safety. Included in that is 8.5 new positions, 6 for the police department, 2 for the fire department, and a half a position for our police accountability department. In addition, there's more funding for police and fire academies in response to some of the vacancies that we have, retirements, as well as past growth. There's a recommendation for funding for an upgrade to our police records management system. And as we look at the outer years of the forecast, there's an allowance for staffing for the Northwest Station, as well as flexibility for other staff growth. As we look at the capital budget, about just under a third of the capital budget is dedicated towards public safety. We have 2 fire stations, Fire Station 5 and Station 13 out in the Northwest. We have 4 new fire engines, numerous investments in police vehicles, a mobile command center, radios, and other technology. And then in the outer years of our forecast, we have funding for fire station remodels, a relocation of fire logistics, and other growth-related facilities.
Any questions about that? Eric, I have a question about the new fire engines. If we approve this, in the past, we've had discussion about moving toward smaller engines in places where it makes sense. and just wondered what the discussion will be in terms of expanding this money once we approve it, if we do.
I'm going to look to the fire chief for that one.
Thank you.
Council President Clegg, members of council, we have explored that option. We're working with Pierce. As you know, Pierce is the manufacturer that we use. They are coming out with a hybrid engine, fire engine, that we're paying very close attention to, and that will get us to where you're talking about. Some smaller engines with same compartment space. We're not going to decrease service, same equipment, but that technology is currently being developed. We anticipate over the next probably 2 to 3 years, they're going to perfect that, where that will be an option for us.
Thank you.
Next slide is kind of an overview of our cash flow reserve. So I mentioned earlier in the presentation that there was a recommendation to amend the calculation used in our annual reservation for the cash flow reserve. So what we've done historically, and this is per policy, is allocated 8% or had a goal of 8% of the general fund budget being held in the cash flow reserve. And it was about 3 years ago, maybe four, that we actually achieved that 8% level. And subsequent to that, we've been increasing by 8% of our annual growth and making contributions into our cash flow reserve. As we looked at the cash flow reserve and really thought about the calculation, a recommendation is in place to slightly amend it. We would still aim for 8% of our general fund budget being held in our cash flow reserve, but it would be 8% of the general fund budget after excluding contingencies and after excluding our annual capital transfer. And the reason for that is if there was ever an emergency, we could always look to those funding sources anyhow to support operations. The purpose of the cash flow reserve is for unanticipated revenue reductions or unanticipated expenditures that might come our way. And those two funding sources being removed still make them available. But in other words, including them in the basis for this calculation, there might have been a little bit of double counting. So we're eliminating that going forward. We're recommending to eliminate that. And that reduction results in about a $1.3 million reduction as part of the FY23 budget. And then it's fairly consistent going forward at 8%, albeit on a lower base. Okay, I'll move on to an overview of our capital fund. The FY23 capital fund budget is $82.9 million. It's described in detail within our budget book, but that's a higher level investment than we've seen in recent years. A large reason for that is because we had accumulated fund balance for planned projects, and this is the year that some of those projects are coming to fruition. Included in that would be Fire Station 5, Fire Station 13 out in the Northwest, relocation of our parks maintenance facilities, so on and so forth. There are some large investments in public safety. Those two aforementioned fire stations. I'll note that the Northwest Station does include some space for police, for fire engines, and then investments in police major equipment. There are also some significant contributions to affordable housing, $13.5 million transfer to housing funds using funds previously programmed for that purpose. If we look back to last budget cycle, there was a discussion about reserving those funds for this purpose. This year, we're going to move them over to the housing fund. There's also the parks maintenance downtown facility relocation recommended. I'll note that the current facility at adjacent to Julia Davis Park is nearing the end of its useful life and is in need of replacement. When we look at capital fund revenues, there's two primary sources. There is an annual transfer from the general fund, which in fiscal year 23 makes up about 44% of the overall revenues on our capital fund. We also do transfers into the capital fund from our impact fee fund to support impact fee eligible projects. That represents about 43% of capital fund revenues. The other primary source I'll call out here is electric franchise fees. We account for those in our capital fund, make up just under 10% of our revenues. One other tidbit I'll mention is that for fiscal year 23, there's a plan to recognize $1 million in ARPA receipts for broadband activities, a continuation of the project that was first approved in May by the City Council. As we look at the capital fund forecast, we've taken a 5-year view, and there are numerous projects which are described in more detail within the budget document that are planned. And over the 5-year period, we anticipate that we'll be balanced. You can see in fiscal year 22, our ending fund balance, of $67.2 million, a significant drawdown of that in 23 because of some of those previously mentioned projects. You can see, however, that in fiscal years 24, 25, and 26, it dips below zero. So we're going to have to do some work to look at the timing of different projects, but we know that within the 5-year view, based on our current estimates, that we have sufficient funding to execute on the projects that are planned.
Eric, does this projection include an increase in impact fees, or is it impact fees at current levels?
It includes an increase to impact fees.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
So when we look at development impact fees, there were numerous discussions that Travis led with the City Council over the last year around an update. And the city or any agency that collects impact fees is required per state code to update their impact fee plan every 5 years. The City Council approved the City of Boise's update in February or March of this year. There is a recommendation to increase those fees effective October 1st by 13.1%. To reflect last calendar year's activity. This recommendation was brought forward to our Development Impact Fee Advisory Committee and was unanimously recommended earlier this month, due entirely to cost escalation that we're seeing. We're seeing very rapid cost escalation, and if impact fees are going to do their job and having growth pay for growth, they need to be increased. The metric that is being used is a building cost index from Engineering News Record. That index is widely used for this purpose within the state of Idaho. You can see that the 13.1% increase that's being recommended is dramatically higher than what that index has shown over the last 10 years. It's, trended around the 2 to 3% range. And we would anticipate that in future budget cycles, once the inflationary environment settles down some, we'd probably return to that level of increase on a go-forward basis.
So I think what you're telling us, Eric, is if we don't do this, we'll be in even more negative territory in terms of the capital fund overall, and we won't be able to keep up with the cost of construction.
That's a better way of saying it. Yes, we'll probably have to look at making some compromises on the projects that we seek to deliver upon, and probably fall behind on our growth some.
Thank you.
Development impact fees are a key revenue source for growth-related capital expenses. In fiscal year 23, just under $17.5 million recommended to be used out of impact fees. Of that amount, $10.3 million dedicated towards fire station 13 and related engine. Then you can see parks investments, new parks, as well as various other improvements, investments at Bora Park, Magnolia, the build out of Primrose Park out in the Northwest, further investments at Spalding Ranch, and contribution towards relocation of the park's maintenance facilities or expansion of that new facility. Another component of our capital fund is major equipment. You can see in this slide here that the proposed investment is $12.2 million for major equipment. The two largest allocations out of this are directed towards public safety, police at 37% and fire at 31%. Investments in this category for public safety will cover those previously mentioned fire engines, a mobile command vehicle for our police department, police patrol vehicles, radio upgrades, other equipment. There's $100,000 for unexpected price increases, as well as some non-vehicle replacement investments, such as shelving replacements for the library that are recommended. Major repairs and maintenance. You can see a 3-year trend on the left-hand side. It's going up. Major repairs and maintenance is really the first place we look when we're developing our annual capital budget to ensure that our assets are well maintained and safe. Of the planned investment in fiscal year 23 of $7.5 million, 56% of that is dedicated towards parks and recreation. That investment covers a wide variety of different things, anything from pool repairs to greenbelt repairs. Outlined in the budget document are some other uses up to and including pickleball surface at our parks. You can see an investment in our library at 18% and public works at 1.3 million or 24%. The public works investment is largely facility related, and that would include City Hall West, as well as all of our fire stations. In terms of projects that are planned for fiscal year 23, you can see on the right-hand side, that pie chart, about 46% of the project-related funding is dedicated towards fire for those 2 fire stations. Parks at 23.5 million or just under 48%, with investments also towards IT, HR, arts and history, and public works. The parks investments are largely influenced by the parks maintenance facility at $19 million, but also those previously mentioned Spalding, Magnolia, Bora, and Primrose Park investments. I'll note that 49.7 million excludes the $13.5 million recommended transfer to our housing fund, as well as some of the major repairs and maintenance projects, which we've demonstrated as capital projects, but really have been reflected on this previous slide as MRM. Those are the roadway improvements at Julie Davis Park, as well as some whitewater improvement projects.
So go ahead, Councilmember Pro Tem.
Excuse me. So Eric, I just wanted to kind of see if I'm historically understanding our capital fund right. So for years, we were saving up a whole bunch of money to build a library. We're not building that anymore. Very sad, still very sad about it. But now we're reallocating that money that we had saved up over a number of years into fire stations. We passed a fire bond back in the day that was insufficient to actually, I think Fire Station 5 was supposed to be part of that. It was insufficient to build Fire Station 5. So now that's coming out of our capital fund. We're building the Northwest Fire Station, very necessary, out of our capital fund. We're relocating parks maintenance facilities that will likely also free up some land for housing for 19 million. So now we're drawing down on that savings that we had intended for a library, did not end up being a library. Now we have some other priorities. Is that just kind of a generally fair statement, or am I kind of incorrect in my recollection?
I would say it's a generally fair statement. I would say that for some of those investments, it's not necessarily coming from the library. A good portion of the investments that we've made or are recommending last year and this year are coming from that balance that was accumulated, but also some of those projects were planned savings, and now is the time that we're actually able to execute.
Thank you. And I'm also hoping, I mean, I don't think that anyone ever hopes for a recession, but the benefit of a recession to us would be that maybe we won't see as many cost overruns as we've seen in recent years as we're implementing some of these capital improvements. Is that something that everyone's kind of keeping an eye on?
Absolutely. It's something we're watching very carefully.
So Eric, one point I've been thinking about, last time we had a bubble like this in capital projects, the subsequent year we had a bubble in arts and history 1% projects. And arts and history, frankly, wasn't positioned well to be able to manage that bubble. So have we been thinking about that going forward?
It's a good question. We certainly do have a heightened level of investment towards the arts and history percent for art allocation. And I think that staff is evaluating how best to utilize that funding. I would anticipate them to come forward with some recommendations over the coming months.
Yeah. So we just need to be aware of that. And if we need to help with some capacity, whether it's, contract or full-time, we need to figure it out, hopefully before we can't really utilize the 1% funding.
Correct.
Thank you.
So I'll do a brief overview of fees and charges. The budget document includes all fees that are proposed to be increased or are brand new fees. I'll note that the budget document doesn't include fees that are staying the same, that are proposed to stay the same year over year, nor does it outline fees that are being amended via ordinance. A good example of that would be our development impact fees. Any new fees that are increasing by greater than 5% or are new require a public hearing, and that public hearing is scheduled for July 19th, 2022, and the fee increases are approved via resolution. The majority of all fee adjustments that are recommended are to keep up with cost increases. And if fees aren't adjusted to keep up with increasing costs, that difference needs to be made up from somewhere else. So a brief overview of fee increases in the general fund. As mentioned, they're largely to keep up with increasing costs. We do have the continuation of that scholarship funding in our Parks and Recreation Department to ensure that cost does not inhibit youth from participating in parks programs. Within planning and development services, there's a approximately 5% increase for current planning fees recommended. And then within Department of Finance, adjustments to parking licenses and animal fees. When we look at recommended adjustments in our other funds, within water renewal, there is a 9.9% recommended increase for commercial, 7.5% increase for residential included. Solid waste fund includes a 3% rate increase recommendation. I'll note that there was an addendum that was issued to some of the public works fees. It was issued yesterday. I think it was distributed to the city council. It's also been posted as part of the budget document for our public works fees. Basically, some of the connection fees have either been taken out to be brought back at a later date that were proposed to be added, or some of the increases have been taken out, which will be brought forward for council consideration at a later time as well.
Madam Mayor. Thank you. Just a question about the scholarship funding for Parks and Rec programs. Do we know if that's adequate, or do we need to increase that?
Thank you for that question, council member. We look at that on an annual basis. We do anticipate that the current level of investment in that should be sufficient. We'll continue to monitor throughout the year And as we commit each year, if we start to come up against that threshold, we would bring forward a recommendation to adjust.
Thank you, Eric.
The last note on fee changes, going back to development impact fees of the 13.1% increase recommended. That's not outlined in our budget document because they're housed via ordinance. There's a separate ordinance that needs to be amended apart from the budget ordinance. So we'd have a separate hearing on July 19th to amend those fees. Again, they were approved by DFAC earlier this month. Be happy to pause for any questions on fees that the council might have.
Looks like,
Madam Mayor,
go ahead,
Um,
Councilmember.
I don't remember ever getting, and pardon me if I was just absent this week, but getting kind of a rundown on the arts and history fees. Did we get a memo?
I don't think we ever have, and maybe Director Holloway would tell us about that.
That would be really great because I don't really know what any of these things mean or what they're for.
Yes, Madam Mayor, Council Member Woodings, the proposed fees are really just placeholders right now. Working with our staff on looking at the 2023 cycle, which we would need to get in and approved now, or we'd have to wait till 2024. But it's really a proposed placeholder that to start charging for some of the services that we provide and providing that value for those services. So we're looking at some potential education classes, some admissions to different events that we could hold, and then looking at charging for some of the tours that some that we offer currently and some that we're proposing potentially in 23 to offer as well. So we're still working on what all of those different types of programs that would fit into those categories will be. But if we missed this cycle, then we'd have to wait a full another year. And I believe that in talking to our team, even though I know a new director may have a different philosophy, it doesn't have to be utilized. So just because it's there doesn't mean that we would actually charge for those services. There would still be a corresponding scholarship request as well that would need to come with those, so that if we're charging for a particular educational class, that no one would be prohibited from attending that class for lack of being able to afford to do so. So it's really kind of a placeholder right now to see what would fall into those categories moving forward.
Great, thank you.
And to be clear, Doug, you or staff would come back to us once those are fully fleshed out for an update and a nod. But this makes it possible for when that happens for us to collect fees if council decides that, yes, they agree with the direction proposed.
Madam Mayor, that is correct.
So Doug, to that end, thank you, Madam Mayor. I was going to ask, would it be appropriate when we have the fee hearing for us to give direction that as these fees are developed, that we come back to a work session?
Council President Clegg, yes.
Thank you.
We can do it at that time. Thank you.
Any other questions about the fees? Thank you.
So in terms of next steps, as part of this meeting, we'd be looking to the council for motions, in other words, direction to proceed to the next phase in the approval process, which would be the public hearing scheduled for July 19th. At that public hearing, we would at that public hearing date, we'd actually have 4 distinct public hearings, one on the budget itself, one on the fees that are approved via resolution, or the ones that are included outlined in our budget document, development impact fee adjustment, because that one is updated via an amendment to the ordinance, and then a 4th one being a foregone property tax hearing, reserving that $979,000 that I mentioned earlier. Subsequent to the public hearing, in any adjustments that might come out of that, we would have the first reading of the budget ordinance on August 16th, subsequent readings on the 23rd, and the budget adoption on August 30th. That August 30th meeting, we'd also come to City Council to review the L2 form, which basically is used to certify our property taxes and turn around the next day and provide that to the county.
Okay, so thank you. So I want to understand, each of you had proposed motions at your desk this morning. Those motions cover the budget public hearing and moving forward toward that. This isn't, if you vote for this today, you're not voting to set the budget, you're voting to move the budget as it's proposed in our budget book forward to public hearing so the public can comment on it. And then in addition to the motions that we have before us, you need a motion to direct staff to set a public hearing for the fees changes, the development impact fee changes, and to accept the foregone property tax.
Council President, yes, with the exception that the motions that you have before you include the fees.
Oh, it does
So
include the fees.
So we would
Okay.
just be looking for the development impact fees and foregone.
Thank you. All right, well, with that, we are open for discussion, questions. There's folks in the back of the room if you have any questions on any of the specific proposals. And I will open it to various city council members if you have any of those.
Madam Mayor, I do have a question. So I think it was in 2020, or it was probably in the 2021 budget. I think we requested a study for fire and police positions. And I'm just wondering if we don't have enough information to use that study for this current budget, I believe. And so I think the hope would be for our next one that information might be there in time. Am I getting that correct?
Yes, that's correct. The study is underway. Much of the data has been gathered, but the analysis hasn't been complete yet. It's getting close to the time that the first of that will come to a work session, but not in time for this budget.
Okay, thank you.
I think, Madam Mayor, did you want to make a statement, and is it now, or do you want to wait till after the motions?
Sure. I'll go ahead. I wasn't sure if I was going to jump in at the beginning or now, but then by the time I was turned on, everybody was taking roll. I just wanted to say a couple of things. First, thank you to staff for all the work that got us to this point, and to council, frankly, for the work that we've done together throughout the winter and then in the spring to get us here. And of course, Madam President, for presiding today, since I'm working remotely with COVID. Feeling better, really looking forward to getting into the office. This budget is, I'm proud of it and really appreciative of the partnership with each of you and the work that staff has done because it focuses on people. And Boiseans have made clear that that's incredibly important, that we invest in our community priorities, which it also does, while providing a conservative property tax approach. That's really been our overarching goal. And I believe that this one accomplishes it. I took some notes because I wasn't sure how I'd be feeling today. So I'm going to be looking down and up at the same time. But in the last several months, and in particularly in the last several weeks, I've continued to hear from folks that they're concerned because they're feeling the impacts of inflation. And then yet another surprise and additional worry when they saw their assessments in the mail, my family included. And that's why we had that discussion today about the impact of the shift and to help us start to think about how we seek and advocate for change so that there's relief there. The city can't affect it all, but where we can affect property tax relief, we will. The things that we need to see are we need residents to not have to be expected to subsidize commercial, and we need to stop that shift that we've seen so drastically in the charts. We need to see that the homeowner's exemption is indexed so that as our property values increase, the homeowner's exemption does as well. Appreciate that it was lifted to $125,000 a couple of years ago, but that's static. And if only our property values at this point were static, then it would make sense, but it needs to be indexed. And I think it's really important that there be more transparency on how assessments are made so that all of us as residents understand and then can come up with real solutions to some of these issues related to it. But what we can do as a city, we've done in this budget, and that is to keep our base growth low, to fund property tax rebates for qualifying homeowners. I'm so excited that we now have the opportunity to provide a city-based circuit breaker program because of the legislation, and so happy that we're taking advantage of that because our residents need it, and we need to grow the awareness of the program so that more folks that deserve it can take advantage of that relief. And then we've presented a fiscally responsible budget that's sustainable while doing what Boiseans want us to do, and that is invest in the priority areas of public safety, affordable housing, economic development. We're responding to growth, and we're taking climate action to prepare for the future for our kids and grandkids. And so appreciate the work that's gone into it and really look forward to hearing from the public and the next stages of the public process around this budget. And thanks for the chance to chat.
Thank you.
All right, with that, Madam Mayor, I have a series of motions. The first motion is to refer the following items for consideration at the public hearing set for July 19th, 2022. Proposed FY 2023 authorized staffing level changes by fund. General Fund 37.83 FTE, Airport Fund 25 FTE, Geothermal 1 FTE, Housing 1 FTE, Solid Waste Fund 0.7 FTE, and Water Renewal Fund 10.6 FTE.
I think Lisa seconded.
Sorry, I missed that. We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on this motion? I guess I would just briefly say, although this is a larger increase in FTE than we typically see, as noted, it on average really is about the same as what the city has been experiencing. More importantly to me, many of these positions are being paid for by revenues that are indicated by the growth that we're seeing. And so for me, this is, I'm happy to see us responding to growth by actually maintaining our service levels and look forward to hearing from the public on this. Would the clerk please call the roll?
Agent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willetts,
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
And the next motion I would like to make is to refer the following items for consideration at the public hearing set for July 19th, 2022. Recommendation to implement the proposed user fee increases of 5% or less and to submit the proposed user fees greater than 5% and newly proposed user fees.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Agent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willetts. Yes. Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
And I'd like to move that we refer the following items for consideration at the public hearing set for July 19th, 2022. Funding allocations for the FY 2023 contingency accounts, operating contingency, City Council strategic planning contingency, downtown central district maintenance contingency, revenue neutral contingency, and property tax contingency.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Agent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willetts.
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
And now I'd like to move that we refer the following items for consideration at the public hearing set for July 19th, 2022. FY 2023 major equipment, major repair and maintenance, capital recommendations, and percent for art, as presented, including the use of the operating contingency for the operating impact of capital projects, if applicable and necessary. This is inclusive of major equipment, major repair and maintenance, capital, human resources, information technology, Office of Community Engagement, Parks and Recreation, Planning and Development Services, Public Works, the Open Space and Clean Water Levy Fund, the Airport Fund, Solid Waste Fund, and Water Renewal Fund.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Would the
Madam
clerk
Mayor.
please call the roll?
Madam Mayor,
Oh,
just real
sorry.
quickly.
ahead.
I did make some comments earlier about the capital fund and I think that because of its history, I think it's really important that we recognize that we have had a major shift in how we're investing our capital from the way that a lot of it was intended. But those are changes that have been demanded of us by our residents in many ways, and really show the increased needs that we've seen, especially in the areas of housing and public safety. So I'm really supportive of that, but did just want to make sure that the history of a lot of those funds were also recognized.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Bajent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willetts,
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Madam Mayor, I move that we refer all other budgeted amounts as presented for consideration at the public hearing set for July 19th, 2022, including foregone property tax revenue and development impact fees.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Bajent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willetts,
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Thank you. And thank you all to all of the staff for your hard work on this. And I know it hasn't ended. We'll see you again on July 19th, but this is a great step forward. Thank you so much. And with that, we have an executive session.
Oh, yes, we do. Madam Mayor, I move that we go into executive session, personnel, land acquisition, records exempt from public disclosure, pending probable litigation, communicate with risk management regarding pending probable claims, labor contract, Idaho Code 74-206, 1B, C, D, F, I, and J.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Would the clerk please call the roll?
Bajent,
Yes.
Clegg,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Sanchez,
Yes.
Willetts,
Yes.
Woodings.
Yes.
All in favor, motion carries.
Thank you. And we will see the public back here at 12 p.m. for our regularly scheduled day meeting.